Hi everyone, welcome to week 3. This week we're going to be delving deeper into some of the concepts that we discussed last week in terms of neoliberalism and education. Last week we began to touch on the concept of neoliberalism. In Peter Moss's video, he draws attention to the ways in which capitalism and neoliberal logics predicate what is valued and thus foregrounded as important in early childhood education. So these logics create the conditions in which educational projects are grown and what then leadership is committed to. And they create particular orientations to thinking and being, subjectivities that uphold these dominant values. So in a neoliberal landscape, early childhood education becomes an economic investment, a preparation for a future that is based on productivity, developmental benefit, and economic success and supposed freedom. It's also a future that aims to expand its normative ideologies across spaces of difference, and as Vintimilla argues in her article this week, into every sphere of public life. So this week we'll be considering what is neoliberalism and how does it provoke you as an educator. We'll be introducing ourselves to ideologies of neoliberalism and thinking through examples of how it functions in early childhood spaces, as well as our implication in its operations. So consider what questions you might ask of yourself as an educator and as a leader as you notice and disrupt these rationalities. So leadership, in a feminist post-foundational sense, requires that we puncture these normative ideologies about the ways in which we assume things have always been done, and to investigate how our own subjective relations continue to enable these logics, often unwittingly. So in this course, I encourage you to stay away from grand narratives that claim what needs to be done, what educators ought to do or to advocate for, but rather investigate what are the discourses that are surrounding early childhood education as a field, and to interrogate these stories to get a sense of where they may come from and who they may serve. So try to make the invisible visible and grapple with some of the tensions that are proposed in these acts of noticing. In our readings and in the video last week, Moss warns against naive and reductionist technical fixes to current systems, as if an implementation of a program or a tweaking of this educational machine, will disrupt or fix the deeply systemic problems that are at the base of early childhood education and the rationalities that perpetuate them. So he problematizes the notion that an increasing in governance over children and adults will result in better outcomes. This is a radical reorientation to educational leadership beyond management discourses. He says there's no magic potion that will fix these problems of our times, yet there are some conditional commitments to education that inhibit a possibility for the otherwise. When the educator and child are viewed as passive disseminators or receivers of a service, when early childhood educators are seen as selling products to parent consumers, and when education is always seen as preparatory. For example, educators are often concerned over when learning will begin. Families are often concerned over when learning will begin, when outcomes will occur, rather than on what is already happening and what's already in motion and why. And this isn't to place blame on families or individual educators, but rather to pay attention to what are the orientations and views about knowledge and how knowledge is valued, and how these discourses create those values. So in your responses, try to stay away from moralizing these concepts or reinforcing a sort of binary or dichotomous way of thinking that will inhibit our movement and will inhibit the complexity of our dialogues. So try to avoid painting a good or a bad picture about the field, or what someone ought to do or what's the wrong thing to do. Try to think more in the middle of things, pick up on the complexities of capitalist rationalities and how these logics aren't just out there. They're not really something to combat or oppose, but rather how might you get close to them and figure out their intricacies. How are you also implicated in the movement of these discourses? So again, consider your implication and the nuances that come in noticing that implication. Neoliberalism exists within systems of knowledge production that are informed by socio-political and economic movements. So in this way, our arguments need to push beyond individual morality, individual choice, and look more toward the systemic conditions that predicate one's ability to respond. So this disposition toward individualism, where individual responsibility is placed in the consumer, is a product of a capitalist mentality that functions within neoliberal worlds, where individual success is predicated on personal wealth and accumulation and autonomy, free choice. So this week we'll begin to work more on noticing the ways in which we're already neoliberal subjects and how are we implicated in that subjective process. So what is neoliberalism? In this week's article by Christina Vintimilla, she quotes Springer, Birch, and McLevy when they write, at a base level, we can say that when we make reference to neoliberalism, we're generally referring to the new political, economic, and social arrangements within society that emphasize market relations, retasking the role of the state and individual responsibility. Most scholars tend to agree that neoliberalism is broadly defined as the extension of competitive markets into all areas of life, including the economy, politics, and society, end quote. And I'm sure that some of you have already heard about this if you've had a class with me before, but I think that it's important to always revisit and reinterrogate these ideas from a different lens, and in this context, it will be of leadership. So neoliberal society undermines the governing mechanisms of democracy that enable a public question. It sort of pacifies this resistance or this curiosity, a public voice. So under the guise of privatized individual agency, neoliberal systems pacify collective or public thought and place responsibility of social order in the individual consumer and in their relation within capitalist markets. So in this week's reading, Vintimilla argues that focusing on neoliberalism's political and social consequences requires us to think about neoliberalism beyond only economic definitions and examine it as, quote, a rationality, one which expands its normative ideology and values to other spheres of our lives through specific discourses and practices, end quote. So as early childhood educators, we can think about how does neoliberalism provoke us? How do its logics inform the norms in which we situate ourselves in our educational projects? How does neoliberalism show up in our work and in our daily lives? So things like individualism, competition, autonomy, these are all too familiar discourses in early childhood education that are visible in concepts like free play, free choice, stations, where children can move freely in the early childhood classroom from station to station, autonomously, freely enjoying, happy. Yet this illusion of freedom is actually reliant on the very specific yet often unnoticed social surveillance and governance that regulate children's bodies in ways that ensure they're able to grow and develop into autonomous, accumulating, freely acting consumers. So you can see how these seemingly banal, commonplace ways of being in early childhood education are not neutral, they're not innocent, they do come from somewhere. And they have particular logics that are attached to them. So under neoliberalism, things and people gain value as long as there's some kind of gain or profit attached. So the early childhood center is very much a place of hyper neoliberalism. In BC, it has become, as Dahlberg, Moss, and Pence write, a service, which within the structure of supplier-client relations produces particular conditions where parents and families become clients, children the product, and early childhood institutions as the sellers. So this creates educational experiences that are focused on pleasing the consumer and the service provided. The educator becomes a deliverer or a disseminator of knowledge in the pursuit of sale, growth, and profit. The educator is no longer an intellectual, a thinking subject beyond efficiency. Focus is much more on functionality and efficiency and quickly producing results. Knowledge becomes a commodity in this way, fragmented, memorizable, easily swallowed and digested in the pursuit of individual success and linear accumulation. And developmental psychology is one facet of the neoliberal narrative, which is particularly dominant in education, especially early childhood education. So things like ages and stages, learning outcomes, evaluation, quality, all of these concepts are deeply informed by this desire to progress, produce, and accumulate, preparing to be ready for the next step in the pursuit of success and this illusory freedom. So in times of hyperglobalization, neoliberal market economies have created particular popular and desirable images of the productive child that's not only developmentally sound, but also increasingly flexible, creative, adaptive. This child has skills and mentalities that are deemed necessary to be productive contributors in the fast-paced, competitive global market of the 21st century. Yet what is not challenged here, or not changed here or challenged, is this strong colonial value that links children's abilities as an instrument for economic gain, accumulation, and expansion. So individualism and competition is thus intensified in this time of advanced capitalism. So in response to these discourses, Moss asks us, what is the diagnosis of our time? What is our image of the child, of the educator? What is knowledge and how do we learn? And most importantly, last week he asked, what is education for? When we delve deeply into these questions, we see that education is a fundamentally political project. It's based on the conditions of our times. It's a response to the conditions of our times. And thus leadership requires an active, dynamic subject, a thinking subject that's not mummified in a passive assumption of normativity. It's an attitude of questioning. Much of this leadership work is forged around a pedagogy of paying attention, an art of noticing, and the ability to ask a good question. This week, you'll be putting into question some of the discourses that have perhaps become taken for granted in early childhood education. In your provocation this week, you'll be using photography specifically as a way of paying attention to symbols of neoliberal rationality. So considering how does neoliberalism show up in early childhood education, you'll be using photography as a way of paying attention to compose a series of photos that highlights one symbol of neoliberal subjectivity in an early childhood context. So select one symbol and investigate it closely. Consider what values does this symbol embody? What narratives does this symbol tell? What does the symbol tell of the image of the child, of the educator? What is the purpose of education from the lens of this symbol? So some examples might be desks and chairs in the classroom, furniture which governs our movement toward particular ways of paying attention, a clock, a way of governing bodies in time and temporality. You could look at children's toys, trace the stories and the narratives of where these toys actually come from. Consider how these things are more than merely objects, rather they're artifacts that tell complex stories that are based in the social political discourses and constellations in which they're positioned. So this will be very much an act of paying attention to these stories, the symbolic value of an artifact and what it tells. So some other things that you could consider are color. Colors found in early childhood spaces tell us something. Primary colors of yellow, blue, and red perhaps point again to notions of child development. The songs and routines that often play out at circle times have particular ways of gathering children together and governing bodies. and these routines come from somewhere. You could look into children's books to unpack and critique discourses of literacy, images of children and family in the media, ads, images of early childhood spaces that reinforce notions of free flow happiness and fun consumeristic play. You might choose to pay attention to how neoliberalism extracts concepts from their relational and historical origins and appropriates them into a commodity to be digested, to be quickly memorized. There are many examples of this that you might find. One of the examples that I'm thinking of that's come up for us at the school here in Ecuador is Halloween. This was a big conversation for us in paying attention to discourses of neoliberalism and how we might inherit and respond to them. We move through these motions of Halloween, trick-or-treating, dressing up in costumes, yet we often don't know the histories of these activities, the stories that they continue to tell, and why it is that they're practiced here in Cuenca, as it's not necessarily a part of Cuencan tradition, but it has become super popular here, and there's a strong influence from the United States and Europe that makes its way into the discourses of education. So we've been discussing how colonialism and neoliberalism are very much active here, though we don't often notice. Though we're not saying that we're going to do away with all things Halloween, but rather we're using these encounters as an invitation to notice the tensions that are at play here, as an opportunity to investigate the worlds in which children are inheriting and how we want to respond as educators, how we want to mitigate our pedagogical responses toward other subjectivities, other ways of being, with attention to the worlds children are inheriting. Not to create some space of like purity or separation, but rather to create educational spaces where children are invited to think deeply about how they're engaging with these worlds that we discussed last week are both wounded and flourishing. So again, this assignment will very much be an exercise in paying attention. So yeah, I think that's about it for now, everybody. Thank you so much, and looking forward to seeing you on the forums.